Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for opening. My name is Varanta Minima. If it's your first time seeing my face, like I said, my name is Varanta Minima. I'm a med student studying medical radiography, my third year. And apart from my medical studies, I'm also a top rated medical writer. And today, I have an when I say amazing, I mean it, an amazing guest speaker all the way from the UK. Hey, Vicky, could you introduce yourself to the audience?
Oh, hi, Ransom. That's very kind of you. Yeah, I'm Vicky Sherwood. I am a biopharma professional. I'm a medical writer by training, and I write a blog called Biomed Badass, which helps STEM professionals obtain careers in the biopharma industry and also increase their ability to grow their careers in that industry as well.
That is an amazing intro, Vicky. So we have some questions for you to answer for the public. You ready?
Sure.
So I want to put a disclaimer out there. If I'm looking downwards, I'm reading the questions to Vicky. So I've written down the questions down. So I'm reading it. See if I'm looking downwards. So you've been wondering what's Ryan's from finding downwards. All right. So I said this, Vicky. I said this. I used to say it in one of my videos. I was invited, to come talk to people, some UK medical students about arts of freelancing. So, it was a Zoom meeting call, so we had like the students at the backstage, So I was doing the calling, the representing. So I had my representing paper in front of me. So I was looking down and talking. So the host told me that we got a message in the chat, and people were wondering why am I looking downwards for. So I had to just put a disclaimer and say, hey, I'm looking at my represented, paper. So that's why I say it on my videos. So don't be saying, what's he looking downwards for? So yeah. So the first question goes this way. What made you to transition from the biopharmaceutical industry to becoming a medical writer and a host for the Biomed Badass blogs? So tell me.
Yeah, so I was a career academic for many years, and I decided to make a career transition into biopharma as a medical writer. And my speciality is in medical communications, medical writing. I worked for agencies to begin with, and then I moved over into big pharma, became a hiring manager at a large Swiss biopharma company. And during those career transitions, lots of people were asking me questions about my career, particularly when I first made the transition from academia into medical writing. And people were asking me what I was doing now, where I decided to go, how I made that transition, just to learn more about it themselves. And I realized I was getting repeat questions. So over that period, I thought, well, instead of just answering these questions, and they keep coming to me, why don't I start collecting them onto a blog, onto a central source? And when people reach out to me to ask these sorts of questions, I can direct them to that blog. And that's basically how the blog started. And it's grown from there. And we now put like material on YouTube, a lot of material on social media, and the community's growing. So all the time, the list is growing of people, and I have a regular newsletter that I send out where I try and answer questions that are coming in from the community to try and help them, as I said, make career transitions and also grow a career in the biopharmaceutical industry. So that's kind of how the blog came about.
Okay, so I'm a bit curious about something. How did the
Sure.
name of the blog came out? How did you get the intuition to name it that name? Tell me.
Yeah, I don't think there was much intuition there, Ransom. I It kind of came about just because I thought, I need some really good advice and I need no BS. I need somebody to cut through. When I was thinking about making the transition, I was completely lost. I was a career academic. Most of the people I networked with were academics. I lived in that community for 15 years of my working life. And I decided that I wanted to leave academia and I wanted to go into the biopharmaceutical industry in some way. And I didn't know how at that point. Obviously, I knew I could move into research and development because I was a researcher by training. But I was also well aware there were careers well beyond R&D in the biopharmaceutical industry. And I didn't know how to access that information. And it came about that I started talking to people through LinkedIn. And that's how I came to understand about other careers in the biopharmaceutical industry, and specifically about medical writing. Although I hadn't heard of it before then. And not many people back then, when I was making that transition, were talking about medical writing. It was a complete unknown. And I just felt I needed some resource where I could find information which was clear cut and to the point, and explained kind of the information that I needed during that period of transition in my life. So when I started answering these questions and I thought I'm going to put a blog out there, I thought I'm going to call it Biomed Badass because I was a biomedical researcher. I worked in the biopharma industry. And the questions were coming in from other people who were working in medical research and life science research. So and I thought, well, badass is kind of that sort of badass advice, I guess, that I need. And that's how the name came about as the blog.
That makes sense to me. Thank you so much for sharing that with me. So that draws me to the second question. But before I ask the question, tell us more about that company you were like a formal recruiter for. Tell me.
Yeah,
Novartis, right?
Novartis. Yeah, I mean, I just want to say that anything I say today is my own opinion, nothing to do with Novartis. And I don't work for Novartis anymore. I'm a freelancer now. I wasn't a recruiter for Novartis. I was a hiring manager. So rather than finding talent, I was making the decision about hiring talent, and specifically hiring talent into the medical writing team or the scientific writing team, the medical communications team at Novartis in Dublin. And basically, my role was to, look at the resumes and applications that were coming in from writers, either experienced writers or people who were trying to break into writing, and actually taking those resumes and then making a decision about who we wanted to interview and interviewing those candidates. But the initial screen was done by the HR department or the recruiters that were hired by the HR department to screen the initial resumes, who were then passing them on to us as hiring managers within the business to then look at who we needed in our teams. So that was my actual role at Novartis. So yeah, I have experience with looking at lots and lots of resumes of people who aspiring medical writers or who are already existing medical writers and looking to go and work in big pharma.
Okay, amazing, amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. So that draws me back to the same question. So, as a former recruiter for Novartis, right? What key insights can you share with researchers out there for entering the biopharmaceutical industry? So, tell me and tell the audience as well.
Sure, yeah. So I didn't finish the question there. So as a hiring manager, I can tell you what I was looking for in those screened resumes. So basically, what would pique my interest would be somebody who showed in the resume that they understood the job of a medcoms medical writer. So somebody who understood actually what the role involved, and was able to articulate that clearly in their resume. So rather than just say a resume that was generic for an application to a pharmaceutical industry, it actually specifically spoke about being a writer, being a medical writer. And even if they were an aspiring writer, showing me that they understood what the role involved. And then I was looking for key skills and abilities that they had. So specifically, I was looking obviously for scientific writing. And that was anybody who was coming from a research background has that ability. If they've written papers, if they've written a dissertation, if they've maybe presented their work at a congress or in a poster, that's the sort of technical skills I guess I was looking for. And obviously that somebody who can interpret data, because that's a large part of the job as a medical writer, is being able to interpret the clinical data, and then translate that into key messages for whichever audience it is that you're talking to. And also looking for soft skills as well. So specifically communication skills within a team, say, and an ability to work within an interdisciplinary team was a key skill that we were looking for, because as a medical writer, you might do the writing, but you'll work with lots of other people to develop the final draft. You'll be working with the clients who, who have commissioned the work. You will be working with maybe graphic designers, depending on the project type. You may be working with editors, and you'll be working with other writers within your team as well. So I was looking for people who could work effectively interdisciplinary, who could respect and leverage on diverse perspectives. So really a team player or a collaborator was a key skill. In the interview, more say than in the resume, I was looking for somebody who came across as being adaptable and resilient, able to push a project forward. That's key, because as a medical writer, you're often given a project, and you need to keep pushing it forward with the client, with the support of the client, and making sure that the reviews go through, and gathering all the information on the document about those reviews, and then working on taking in those comments and keep pushing the project forward. So that is actually a key skill as well I was looking for. So somebody who was able to stay resilient when maybe faced with hurdles in a project, which inevitably come at some point, and being able to push through that. And also somebody who's good at learning, who likes learning about clinical research. The biopharma industry is fast-paced. There's rapid changes. There's changes in the technology. There's changes in the way patients are treated with particular diseases, and just being able to keep on top of that and being interested in that and learning about that is a key skill as well. So yeah, I'd say those were the main things that I wanted to come across to make sure that that person had the technical ability to do the job, but also the soft skills and the ability to fit within the team, and that kind of adaptability and resilience were important qualities as well that we were looking for where
Amazing.
we were hiring.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Vicky. That
You're
was
welcome.
inspiring. Thank you so much. So the third question goes this way. Before I ask that question, normally we, the writers and researchers, we face a whole lot of challenges, and especially imposter syndrome and other, challenges we face in our careers. So, can you talk about the challenges researchers face when transitioning to biopharmaceutical and how they can avoid them?
Yeah, I mean, there are challenges. It was difficult for me to make the career transition all those years ago when I did it. It's essentially, it's a career change. It's a career switch. If you're coming from academia, or if you're coming from the healthcare sector and you're breaking into the biopharmaceutical industry, you're moving to a very commercial environment. Now, if you're going into something like research and development, you happen to be a researcher in academia, those are very transferable skills that are then a bit of an easier sell. In a way, that's kind of almost a little bit like a lateral transfer, in as much as you're moving from one sector into another, right? You're moving from academia into the biopharmaceutical industry, but your job may be fairly similar depending on the research that you're doing. You may be doing similar assays, you may be using similar equipment. And I'd say, that comes with its challenges, but it might be an easier sell in as much as you're able to talk about, your technical skills and your knowledge, and you're able to really leverage that on a big scale. If you're doing something like a career transition like me, where I was moving from research into medical writing, I was not only moving from one sector to another, from academia into the biopharmaceutical industry, but I was also moving from one job type into another. So that is, in a way, a bigger step. And so the challenges there are greater. And I think the key thing to overcoming them is to understand, that you have a knowledge gap. You don't know what you don't know, right? And if you haven't worked as that other role before in that other industry, you have got a huge knowledge gap. And then to try and overcome that a little bit and mitigate it as best you can. Now, the best way I found to do that was by talking to people who were working already as medical writers. And for me, that was key. That was absolutely critical. I'm not sure how I would have been able to make that transition without having that knowledge and have done that research by talking to people who were actually doing the job, because it gave me the insights of what their job actually entailed. And it enabled me to also think whether or not I felt I would be able to do that job as well. I always liked the idea of communicating science and talking about science and learning about science. So I was attracted to the idea of writing about science for a living, or medical science. But I wasn't sure, really what the job entailed until I'd spoken to a few medical writers and really learnt what it was they did. And when I had that understanding, it gave me insights into the type of work that they did, industry trends. It gave me the type of language they were using when they were describing their role. It gave me, as I said, the insights and the background knowledge of what those roles entailed. And then I was able to take all that on board and then really leverage that in an interview. So even though I hadn't done the role before as a medical writer, I was able to say, okay, no, I haven't done this. I haven't worked with clients before in that setting, but I do understand what's needed to be able to manage clients effectively, because I've spoken to people who are doing that, and I realize, it requires good communication skills, being organized, project management skills. And so I was able to talk about that in a way that made me sound more credible than if I hadn't done that research. So I think that is a really key thing that a lot of people who are making a career switch don't leverage. They don't do enough informational interviews and talk to enough people doing that actual role to learn about it before actually going to an interview and getting in front of somebody who could give you a job. So I think that's really important. When a lot of career changers think about networking, they think, oh, I've got to get in front of somebody who's going to give me a job. I've got to network my way to somebody who's a decision maker, and they'll take a punt on me if I can impress them. But I think the key thing is not to think about networking in that way. I think it's to think about talking to people who are doing the job you want to do. Ask them for just 15, 20 minutes of their time over a coffee. You can even buy them a virtual coffee now online, and just see if there are people there who are willing to talk about their role to you just for 10 or 15 minutes, and use that time to really do your research and understand more about the role, understand the inside information about that industry, because that is key and absolutely imperative that you understand that to sound like a credible candidate when you go for an interview. Does that make sense?
It does, honestly, it does. Thank you so much for sharing that with me and with the audience as well. You know, I'm a bit curious about something. Before I move to the fourth question, you know, um, what do you have to say about people that don't have any such of backgrounds in science or medicine or biopharmaceutical, industry? So tell me, what are your advice for them? Because I know being a medical writer, the background, having a background in medicine or pharmaceutical bioscience or whatever is not a must, right? But if you have such background, it's like a leverage for you. So what are
Yeah.
your advice for people that don't have a background in, you know, medicine or whatever backgrounds, but they have different background, but they're looking forward to becoming a medical writer out there. So what are your advice for them?
Yeah, and it's definitely possible, because I have worked with people who've come through a different route completely. So I've worked with people who have come through, say, journalism or English as a background, and maybe they've worked as an editor before, maybe for a media company. And then through those editorial skills, have ended up working in a medical communication setting, working with medical writers, and some have even eventually become medical writers themselves. um, I know other people who work in, say, scientific events for pharmaceutical companies, so who project manage setting up large communications events for pharmaceutical companies, who have come through events management career track, and then ended up working in medical communications. So there's lots of different ways into medical communications. You don't have to necessarily come through a scientific background. Lots of people, however, do tend to come through that scientific background, and specifically it's either medicine or it's life sciences often. That said, I've also worked with people who have come through other areas of STEM, physicists, people who were ecologists, all areas. I think the key thing is if you can interpret data and you're happy with handling data and being able to extract information such that you can write messages about that data, you will be able to do the job as long as you can clearly communicate effectively in your writing. And look, we all start off as medical writers very raw in our ability to do this. And, as your career develops, it hones over time. So there is, you will learn on the job as you move through and you develop your career and you progress. So, I wouldn't say you have to have a scientific background. It's not an absolute barrier. There are other ways in, but you may have to think a little bit more creatively. Say if you do want to move into medical writing, into medical communications in the biopharma industry itself, and maybe you're coming from a languages background, you may need to think a little bit more creatively about how you break in. Maybe you get into editing of medical writers' work and come through the editorial route, and then you could transition into medical writing. Or you may have multiple languages that you can then leverage and do medical writing work, translating important information from pharma clients into local languages to use in different geographies throughout the world. So there are definitely other ways in. You may just have to think a little bit more creatively about how you make that step into
Yeah,
medical writing.
absolutely. Thank you so much for that nugget, Vicky. And I believe that the audience greatly adore you for that. So that draws me to the fourth question. Now,
Mm-hmm.
how do you see the intersection of science and communication in the biopharmaceutical industry, and how does it free up time for professionals? So tell me.
Um, the intersection between science and communication in the biopharmaceutical industry. Yeah, so that's an expansive question, Ransom. So, obviously, what the pharma company wants to be able to show is it wants to be able to communicate with the healthcare industry about its technology and about the technologies that it's bringing to the marketplace to help patients and specific patient cohorts. Now, the way in which it does that is to be able to demonstrate to an agency that legislates whether or not you can use a drug in a particular marketplace. It needs to be able to demonstrate that that drug is effective and it's safe. And so you would need, usually the gold standard is a phase 3 clinical study showing effectivity and safety within a particular patient cohort. And then you would get, a license to actually sell that drug to that cohort of patients. So a lot of the communication starts for the pharmaceutical industry around that time when it's trying to make that communication. So it would be through like regulatory writing first to be able to get that application into, say, the FDA, for example, if you want to license a drug to sell in the USA. And then around the time that the drug is going to be launched, there's an awful lot of communication that has to happen around then as well. Now, I'm not saying there's no communication that happens early on. There certainly is. So as a drug is being developed through those early preclinical into those early phase 1, phase 2 studies, there is communication around there as well in publishing the studies, in going to the scientific conferences and talking about those studies. But at that point, there's nothing really that can be done around communication about using the drug, right? It's in the pipeline and it may have potential, and you can talk about that potential, and you can discuss, the risks versus the benefits of whatever data you have at hand, but you haven't got that pivotal study that's going to give enough evidence to show that it's worth bringing that drug into the marketplace for the patients. And so at that point, once it's licensed and the pharmaceutical company is going to go and launch the drug, then the communications can really intensify, and you can also start to bring in commercial communications because the drug is licensed, as long as you talk about those communications in a way that specifically talks about the patient population that the drug is licensed for. So there are lots of compliance laws around, promotional work that you can do and communications that you can do around drugs. When a drug is licensed, and when it's not licensed, you can't do those kind of promotional materials. So, but around the launch, I would say there's an awful lot of communications happening. And then through as the drug, goes through its life cycle, and towards when you get towards the end of the patent, it changes. There's still communications happening as you're getting real world evidence of how the drug is performing in the market globally. Usually, if it's being sold as a global drug, you gather that information, and you look at sub-studies and other information that can give you more insights about how that drug performs in the real world, and you will present those and talk about those and keep those communication channels open. But after that, it starts to, the communications start to dip, and the pharmaceutical company may be looking at applying more resources into other products that it's looking to launch around that time or in the near future.
Wow, 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 wow. So before I move to the last question, I really adore what you just said about the decision between sciences and communications, the working hands together. So how do you keep up with the latest advancements or the latest technologies, in science and communication, and how does it affect your work as a medical writer?
Yeah, so it's interesting because as a research scientist, you focus in on a specific niche of scientific research, and you look at everything about that, and you try and learn everything about it. As a medical writer, particularly as a freelance medical writer, you may be working on diabetes one month, and the next month you may be working on cancer, or it's very diverse, and that's one of the great things about being a medical writer, I think, is that it's been able to open my knowledge base to more areas of medical science than I'd ever been able to do as an academic researcher. So with that comes challenges, right? Because as you rightly point out, how do you keep on top of all that? And I think, it can become very daunting, particularly if you do come from a research background, because a research background, you're told you have to know everything about that specific area before you can, write about it or talk about it or go to a conference and discuss. As a medical writer, it's different, right? Because we are working across lots of different fields. Now, that's not to say you can't specialize in a different area, in a particular area. And I definitely specialized a lot of my early medical writing career in oncology because I came from a cancer research background. But over the years, I have definitely diversified my knowledge base and worked in other areas. So how do you then, be able to bridge that knowledge gap when you take a new project? And there is a period of time when you start a project, it's quite daunting, where you have to try and understand the treatment landscape, the background of how the drugs work, the phase 3 studies that have been done or early phase studies that have been done, preclinical research studies, all this kind of information you've got to try and gather quite quickly. But often when you work on a new project, what you'll find is you're not working in isolation. You come into often a team, and that team will have resources. So if you're hired by a pharmaceutical company to work for, or as a freelancer, if they're your client, or if you're working in an agency and a pharma company is your client, you'll find the pharma company has a lot of information about that particular drug. And then you usually have training resources, decks and materials that you can start to quickly get up to speed with. And so they're usually your first port of call to try and understand the background information before you start writing. And there's usually a bit of time that you can take at the beginning of a project to try and get up to speed with it. And then it's just about keeping on top of the information within that project as you work on it. If anything changes, if you see anything published or anything coming out at a particular conference that's within that niche. So a good way to keep on top of things like that is specific blogs or medics who are high profile within a particular field and are discussing these topics and changes to the patient treatment landscape and all these types of things. You can easily follow those people on social media, and you can just try and keep abreast as much as you can. But if you're in a team, definitely you'll find that team are very up on keeping on top of these things, and they'll be discussing these things all the time. So when the writing teams that I've worked in, you often receive email alerts saying, have you seen the FDA have just approved X, Y, and Z in this particular cohort? Don't miss this information. Here's the data that was used to get that approval. And so the team are very good at communicating and keeping themselves on top of scientific advancements as well, often.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that. So Vicky, we've come to the end of the session, but we have one more last question for you to answer. So, in a nutshell, could you tell us, in your experience, what is it the most important skills that is required for researchers, to develop, their skills to be successful in the biopharmaceutical industry? In a nutshell, could you tell us about that?
Okay. So I guess if I think about it, there's probably three areas, well, two areas that you can develop as a researcher, but three areas that you need to be thinking about. I don't know, we'll discuss the third one. So the first one is obviously your technical and your scientific skills. So if you're going to be moving into a position where you're going to be using those skills, and most scientists would, I guess, want to leverage their scientific education. Same with medics, would want to leverage their medical knowledge to try and break into the pharma industry if that's what they wanted to do. So you would take roles that required scientific and technical understanding. So as I mentioned before, it could be R&D, but equally it could be medical writing, could be medical affairs, could be regulatory affairs, could be sales, because even in sales you need to know, right, how the drug works. You're going to be discussing scientific concepts. So that biological knowledge, that deep understanding of biological processes, pharmacology, medicine, all that kind of good stuff that you're learning as an academic, or you're learning as a medic, can all be leveraged. If you're going to move into R&D, obviously your R&D skills in analyzing experiments, in designing, conducting experiments is great. Obviously, an added bonus if you understand the drug discovery and drug development process on top of that. And the data analysis and interpretation is incredibly important as well. It's incredibly important as the type of medical writing that I do. So proficiency in statistics, not being a biostatistician, but understanding what the statistics mean so that you can interpret the data. And also, being able to read and interpret clinical research is an important thing. And then I guess as an add-on to that, which might, a lot of people might be missing, I think, as researchers, but if you think about like the regulatory knowledge that's used within the pharmaceutical industry, that was certainly a gap in my knowledge. So I had to kind of quickly fill that when I made my career transition. So understanding the regulatory environment, including the FDA, the EMA guidelines around, licensing of drugs, and even things like, good manufacturing process and clinical trial protocols and things like this. I had to get up to speed with those. So if you are thinking about making a transition into the biopharmaceutical industry, it's worth learning a little bit about these topics as well, so that you're already starting to bridge that knowledge gap a little bit ahead of time. And the same goes with quality control and assurance of biopharmaceutical products. As I said, good manufacturing practice, things like that, because it could be that you're not moving into an area of R&D or medical writing like I am, but you might be moving into the manufacturing process. Lots of scientists move into that area as well, and so good knowledge of good manufacturing practices, GMP, is super important as well. And then we move, I guess, back into the soft skills, which we discussed earlier, things like communication and teamwork that I was definitely looking for as a hiring manager, that adaptability, that resilience that I was also looking for. I guess researchers specifically also bring critical thinking and problem solving, which is great. across a range of different professions that you may be using within the biopharmaceutical industry, being able to analyze problems, think critically, innovate solutions to sort them out. That transferable skill transcends lots of careers. And then I think specifically for the biopharmaceutical industry as well, having ethical integrity is a really important one. So, medics will bring that, right? So upholding high ethical standards as a medic, but also, as a researcher, being ethical in your research, non-fraudulent, and being very clear and precise about recording of your data. These are all really crucial things that biopharma industry needs, because it desperately needs to ensure patient safety and compliance with laws and regulations around that. At the end of the day, I think lots of scientists, lots of medics, we're in the industry we're into because we want to help patients. So having that ethical judgment as almost like a value in a way is an important thing as well, I think, to bring into the biopharmaceutical industry. And then the last one, I said there is a third one, and that can be a little bit more tricky because that's usually around more kind of business and management skills. I mean, it is a corporate environment in which you head into the biopharma industry, and things like budget and financial acumen can be a tricky thing from some roles in, say, research, in academic research, to bring in. Now, when I made the transition into the biopharmaceutical industry, I was a principal investigator, and I did hold a budget, funding budget that I held for the lab, and I did have to do a little bit of budgeting around that money and how we spent it on salaries and experiments and resources and reagents for the lab. So I did have a little bit of understanding in and around budgeting, but I mean, the financial aspects of drug development are on a much, much larger scale. And if you do find yourself going into a role where you're more involved in that kind of commercial aspect or financial aspect of the biopharmaceutical industry, it's going to be at a whole nother level that you will ever bring from any other career you may have had in academia or in maybe even in healthcare as well as a practitioner. So I started to get to a point in my career at Novartis where I was getting more into that kind of budget planning and financial planning. And so that was a skill gap that I had to kind of utilize what I had before, but also build on as well. And there's other aspects of business as well. There's like strategic planning, which will get more important as well as you develop your biopharmaceutical career. So, understanding the market, understanding the competitive landscape, setting strategic directions for development and commercialization of certain products or drugs that want to be developed. These are all areas that you may not have, even thought about in a previous academic career, but become very important in that commercial environment within biopharma. Negotiation, partnering skills, being able to talk to other stakeholders within projects, so talking with research institutions, other companies that you may be collaborating with, all these sorts of things as well are important. And project management as well, right? So project managers, it's a very specific career path within the biopharmaceutical industry because it involves looking after timelines, budgets, resources, and team dynamics, and it's an area people specialize in. But having an understanding of that project management and ability to lead a team, which may comprise of a project manager, is also an important thing as you start to progress your career into like management positions. So that kind of business and management skills, I guess, come a bit later, and may not be something that you can leverage straight away. But when you break into the biopharmaceutical industry, they are knowledge gaps that you have to start filling if you want to progress your career. So I guess that was a bit detailed there, Ransom, was it?
Absolutely, absolutely. Honestly, filled with a lot of details on it. Honestly, so thank you so much, Vicky. You've been an amazing guest speaker. due to your tight schedule, you have to just come up to, talk to the audience about, you know, all this stuff, which is very, very understandable and very, very necessary for other medical writers out there to learn from. So we've come to the end of the session. So if you love this content, do well to subscribe, like. So, what are your last words for this wrap of the session, Vicky? What are your last words?
Oh, just a huge thank you, Ransom, for having me on the show and allowing me to talk extensively about the biopharmaceutical industry. I mean, it offers great scope of, opportunities for people who are coming from the healthcare field, who are coming from maybe an academic background like myself. There, those skills are in high demand in the pharmaceutical industry. And if you want to break in, the key thing is to think about those transferable skills that we've discussed today, that you can then leverage on and get your first foot in the door. And it's all about getting your first foot in the door. I think a lot of people get stuck and think, I have to pick my perfect career. But actually, once you get your foot into the door of the biopharmaceutical industry, it opens the whole industry up to you. And I know lots and lots of professionals who have started in one aspect of the biopharmaceutical industry and moved into a completely different part by the end of their career. So there are lots and lots of opportunities once you get in and you start to find your feet and maybe decide you want to move your career in another direction. So don't ever think once you've made that first decision, it's a closed door. There's lots of scope to progress your career further. So I guess,
Absolutely.
yeah, I'll finish there, Ransom, and we'll try and tie off succinctly.
All right. Thank you so much. So, if you, like I said, do well to share this video. Hopefully, someone in your network will definitely adore this video. So, thank you so much,
I
Vicky.
will do. Thanks so much, Ransom, and take care. Speak soon.
All right.
Okay.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.